Welcome back. This is the second part of the labor forum here on Monday, May 23rd. And we have in the studio with us Tiffany Roberts, and I've seen her picture so many times on all the different demonstrations. She is with Lawyers United for a New Atlanta, and she is also an activist with Black Lives Matter, ATL. And as I said, I've seen your picture on many of the demonstrations. We are excited that Annette was able to invite you today. She's actually going to do most of the interviewing. But the reason, well, there's many reasons we wanted you on the air, but partially because of a program that happened this last week that raised an important question to those that are running for the offices, in which it's sort of where people first brush up against an unjust legal system.
Yes.
And so we didn't want to specifically so much talk about that event, but we wanted to really talk about why Black Lives Matter, why this issue. It's not just about when police shoot somebody.
Right.
It's about all of the kind of ways in which it happens, that when we look at who's incarcerated, who's on probation, who has a record.
Right.
We note these incredible disparities.
Mm-hmm.
So, Annette, take it away.
All right. So, first of all, Tiffany, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
We appreciate you being here. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about the school to prison pipeline and kind of some of the history that goes into funneling people of color, kids with disabilities, kids with special needs, at-risk youth into the juvenile detention center, juvenile detention system, and then ultimately into prison. What are some things as far as like policies and just general principles that you see in schools that are contributing to the school to prison pipeline?
Sure. Just a little bit of background. I've never been a juvenile defender, but as a public defender in Fulton County, I did represent teenagers who were charged with felonies because the 17-year-olds can be arrested in Georgia for felonies. And then another issue that we see is State Bill 440. We call them SB 440s. Those are juveniles who were tried as adults. We hear the language, try them as an adult, in superior court for what people refer to as the 7 deadly sins, which includes crimes like murder, rape, aggravated child molestation, armed robbery with a firearm. And those young people are often also charged as adults. And many of the things that occur in schools end up being adjudicated in superior and juvenile courts. I represented 2 young women in DeKalb County a couple of years ago, and they were actually just witnesses to a fight. There was a fight down the hallway. Children scurried out of the way. An officer ran through and began pushing students down the hall. And as he pushed one young lady over, she didn't know it was an officer. She defended herself. She ended up being expelled from school. And I represented her at the disciplinary hearing in DeKalb County. And what I found to be remarkable was that without an attorney present, there really didn't seem to be any avenue for her to say as a young person, this officer pushed me down to the ground. I had no idea who he was when he hit me, and then he proceeded to drag her into the classroom. And when we talked to the officiant, or he was like a judge, we said, well, look, there are some anger issues. This child does have some anger issues. Could we just prescribe some treatment for her and have her reinstated as a student in this school? They did absolutely nothing in the way of treatment. And that's what and they almost seemed to think that I was crazy for asking for some sort of meaningful intervention. So what we are seeing is that on one hand, our children are criminalized. They are put in handcuffs for fights, for disagreements, sometimes just for harsh words in a school. And then on the backside, at the end of that tunnel, you either have a a court where they're being dealt with harshly, or you have a disciplinary hearing for the school district in which their issues aren't being addressed. And even more than that, we're not seeing administrators, educators, police officers being held accountable in the role that they play in criminalizing students and not using their discretion to benefit the students, which is what they should be doing.
Well, I had a question because I think it was it today's paper? I think I just read it. This is about the Justice Department actually looking into Henry County and the disparity again between the number, how many students get actually expelled and get suspended for long, long times out of school. So their education is just totally disrupted. One of the things that strikes me is the presence of what they call school resource officers. And it seems as though they have almost unlimited discretion for escalating something that can be in other times and in other schools just considered a, a little mischief or a little kerfluffle between students, and all of a sudden it becomes almost a criminal offense, and somebody's facing a juvenile record, and then it just goes on and on. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of regulations or rules that boards of education seem to have put in place that don't seem to have any wiggle room to them?
Sure. Zero tolerance policies, I think, are largely responsible for funneling children into the criminal justice system, because zero tolerance policies say if you have a child who gets into a fight, they must be expelled. You must refer it to a law enforcement agency. I took a look at the Atlanta Public Schools website before I came today, and under I believe it was like gang activity, right? There's this list of things that would suggest to the school board or to the school administrator that a child is involved in gang activity. And one of them is just clothing, right? And so it gives administrators the discretion to say, well, I believe that you're in a gang, and as a result, there's zero tolerance, and you must be expelled. There is a kind of a 3 strikes rule for being an unruly an unruly child in the school, in a classroom. And it says that a teacher can designate a child to be a unruly or uncooperative student. And at that point, the child is entitled to a hearing but can be expelled. So again, it's sort of these rules that say we don't deal with any variables that necessarily come with dealing with children who are not fully formed adults, who are still becoming who they are. And we've basically said to children that they must behave like and be held accountable as if they were adults. So you just see a lot of arrests, way more arrests in school than you should see. And then you also have school resource officers who are aware that they have this significant amount of power, and they often use it to target students whom they don't like, students who may challenge their authority, and there seems to be very little taking place in schools to rehabilitate or even to address concerns of students that may actually be valid.
Well, I'm just going to say, everybody saw that video where that resource officer came in and attacked this young woman seated at a desk, and it was all over a cell phone.
Yeah.
Dragged her by her hair, pushed her down the ground. Unbelievable.
Right.
And then she did get charged. And not only did she get charged, somebody who videoed it and made it possible for the rest of us to see what actually happens in these schools, she got charged. Could you talk about that at all?
Sure. Well, I'll talk again about APS because I'm not that familiar with a lot of school districts. The disciplinary rule that permits resource officers to use force against students says they can use force to remove a student who is being uncooperative or who is disrupting a classroom. So if a teacher says, this student is disrupting my classroom because this student won't stop looking at their cell phone, and a resource officer comes and determines that that student isn't compliant, then we basically the government gives them the authority to use force against children when there is probably a less detrimental option available for that student. And we learned later that that young lady was it in Texas?
It was North Carolina.
Was it in North Carolina?
No?
I thought it was in.
I don't remember. But we learned later that that young lady had been homeless, had been orphaned, and had a lot of anxiety around social situations and in school, and that perhaps she'd been bullied. So again, we're saying we give our teachers discretion, but we don't want for them to use their discretion to benefit the children. We're saying we're giving resource officers discretion, but we don't want for them to use that discretion to address the needs of children, and there's something definitely wrong with that.
And I just want to add that you know, I feel like the schools kind of like almost create an environment where they set it up for kids to be quote unquote, you know, disruptful, when they're really just disengaged because of lack of resources or teachers who are unqualified or uncertified. I have a close friend of mine who teaches in Atlanta public school system, and she's constantly telling me how she's having to come out of pocket to pay for you know, just basic school supplies or resources that the state or the school should be providing, and they don't have the funds to do so, you know, and people end up being disengaged from classrooms. They end up being, you know, involved in activities that are not conducive to, you know, moving forward their education, and they ultimately end up getting in trouble in school for circumstances that are, you know, beyond their control, and then the cycle just continues from there, and it's kind of like seems like a systematic socio-political effort to marginalize people of color or people in you know, low income areas, and to keep them at a disadvantage economically.
Really for the rest of their lives, because
Yeah.
once you have a record,
Yeah, that's it.
then it just
That's
it escalates. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about how youth who end up in a juvenile detention center, if you even have any statistics about how many then eventually end up in an actual prison.
I actually pulled up an article. I can pull it up on my phone, but one thing that we know is that in 1994, Georgia passed SB 440, which allowed us to prosecute juveniles as adults. And in 2014, they took another look. I think it was prisonpolicy.org maybe, took a look, and the recidivism rate for juveniles was the same or worse than for adult facilities. And juveniles charged as adults were no less likely to reoffend upon being released. And the worst statistics were juveniles who were detained at juvenile detention centers. I want to say this 1 in 4 within 3 years had picked up another charge. And that is due in part, and I'll back up, and I can say that a lot of my colleagues when I was a public defender who were juvenile defenders to begin with and then came over to adult public defense said that they kept seeing their clients, right? The same child who was arrested for burglary or for possession was later prosecuted for a more serious offense as an adult when he was an adult. And that was certainly true of my practice with my 17-year-olds where there was no intervention, no meaningful intervention, because you have a district attorney who doesn't give prosecutors any discretion to reduce, to recommend treatment. While a public defender, I have heard an assistant district attorney tell me that they don't believe in mental illness, that they don't believe that mental illness causes people to commit crimes. I've had prosecutors refuse to recommend first offender treatment for a first offender. You have young people that you talk to when you talk to them about school that say, well, I can't even bring my books home, right? I say, you know, how are you doing at school? Well, I don't go, I can't bring my books home. They said that, you know, if I miss this many days, I'm going to be arrested. You have young people who tell you, well, whom you ask, who should I talk to? Like, who could I call at the school who might be able to help you? And they don't even know the name of their guidance counselor. They don't know the name of anyone at the school who knows anything about their circumstances. And I think that speaks to what Annette mentioned, which is we have these schools that are basically warehousing children and holding them until they are fit for prison or juvenile detention. There are teachers, we have teachers who care. My husband's mother is an educator in Memphis for decades, and she talks about the same thing, that she would have to purchase things like underwear and deodorant for children who were in her classrooms. But now we have teachers who are spread so thin, who will have these shoestring budgets, who may not even be able to do that. And, moreover, it's not their responsibility. And we could say that it's the parents' responsibility, but if parents don't have resources, if parents were alienated by the school system, then it is our responsibility as a community, but also it's the responsibility of the government. If you're not telling poor children they can't come to school, then you need to have accommodations for poor children or disadvantaged children who come to school. It doesn't make sense that they come and then we blame them for the disadvantages or the baggage that they have to bring with them just by virtue of where they were born or whom they were born to.
And also, you have policies like No Child Left Behind that gives incentives for low-performing schools. That gives incentives for schools who do well, where they will almost encourage low-performing students to drop out, But I have some stats that I wanted to read just to add to what Tiffany was saying. So 57,000 people under the age of 21 are in juvenile detention in the state of Georgia. 95% of school suspensions are for minor infractions, meaning nonviolent. And 70% of school infractions are 70% of school suspensions are put on Black people and Hispanic children. And 68% of males in prison do not have a high school diploma. Last stat, 17.83% of teens tried as adults in Georgia are Black. There's a major racial disparity there, and I wonder what else can we do to change these circumstances when you have kids that are born into circumstances that are under no control of their own, and the economic gap, the class gap just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Like, what do you think are some steps that we need to start taking to start making things better for our kids and our communities and our schools?
Those statistics are disturbing and should be disturbing to anyone who hears them.
Absolutely.
One thing that in Georgia we can pay attention to especially is the Opportunity School Districts. Opportunity School District referendum is going to be on the ballot in November, and it basically is giving the state unfettered authority to take over schools that it considers to be failing based on things like test scores. And there is a concern that something will happen in Atlanta like what has happened in New Orleans, or what happened that caused the Flint water. I don't even know what to call it because it's not a disaster, it's just a crime. But to allow the government to take over and manage communities that it has no experience with, to allow someone who's designated by the governor just to take over. So that's one thing, to vote no on that referendum. Oh, well, to educate yourself. I forgot. To educate yourself about that referendum and to read the language of the referendum, but also just to kind of read a little bit of the background about what it would actually give the government authority to do.
Because I think the thing about that is that there's nothing about the Opportunity School District that talks about more books, more resources, more pay for teachers, roofs that don't leak,
Mold.
Food programs for the kids that don't have food. There's nothing in there. It's just really about how to somehow get the access to taxpayer education money.
Right. No rats in schools, maybe. Another thing is that Atlanta Public Schools is planning on starting its own police department. and will no longer use the services of the Atlanta Police Department. And some may see that as a victory, but you have to understand that there are many school agencies who hire resource officers in their own police departments. Fulton County Schools, I believe, has its own police department, as does DeKalb, and it doesn't change the behavior. So if the mindset has not changed, and if the philosophy behind these sorts of policing of hallways has not changed, then the way that our children are arrested and funneled into the prison system will not change. We have to pay attention to our school board elections. And we have to be present. If you're a parent, you not only have to be present for your child, but you need to be present for the children whose parents can't be there for whatever reason. Instead of this sort of respectability thing where we say, well, it's the parents, it's the parents, it's the parents. Well, children are blameless regardless of whether their parents are involved or not. So at some point, those of us who are interested in education or who are parents need to stand in the gap for those children who need adults there to ensure that they receive the same education on the south side of Atlanta as they receive on the north side of Atlanta.
I think one of the things about the whole question of education is working class people for generations. We have all been both taught and told that education is the thing that is important in order to secure a good job, to be able to have anything of quality in your life, whether just anything. And so that many working class parents, for them, the condition of education, they want their kids to go to a good school, and they want their kids to be able to succeed in that school and not to be criminalized, not to be penalized by the economic situation of the parents, just what you talked about. A lot of the parents that get blamed for things are parents who are working double and triple jobs, or have disabilities themselves, or have no transportation, or I mean a myriad of reasons as to why they can't be at every parent-teacher meeting, and when they're held, and a whole variety of things.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we're not. As a public defender, I had clients whose mothers worked back-to-back shifts as maids in hotels, and we would fight for 15 and other things, that they're not even making a living wage, and they have 2 or 3 children or more to support. And how do we expect them to bake cookies and bring brownies to school, and to go with their children to field trips? Like, how is that supposed to happen when they're just scraping by to survive? Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So we have a couple, 2 or 3 minutes left. A last question, maybe?
Well, do I have a last question? Probably, but I just wanted to add that, some of these police officers who get put in the schools to, quote unquote, monitor.
Is this a second job for the cops? Is this kind of like a side job? The way?
Not typically.
Okay.
So not typically, but
Sorry,
it
No, it's
can
okay.
happen. Yeah,
When you see them standing outside Walmart and stuff like that,
right, that's off duty.
Yeah.
So when the school districts have their police departments, they designate officers for the schools, and I think that the idea is that they get to know the kids and the kids get to know them, the children get to know them.
But see, that's not happening.
No.
They're putting police officers in schools where they don't have any training to even deal with kids that age. They don't have any training to even deal with people, young kids in those circumstances who come from those type of backgrounds. They come from a different lifestyle. They learn in a different way. They operate in a different way than people who, are in different communities from them. So they don't even have the training or skills necessary to deal with these kids. And they're coming from the streets dealing with hardened criminals, and then they're putting this environment and supposed to automatically change their mentality to become counselors. And they don't have that type of, training. So these kids are at a major disadvantage, and it's a systematic effort to that we've prioritized prison over education, and then we're hypocritically saying that education is the most important thing for anybody to get ahead. So that's just what I wanted to add. It's just I just think it's really important for people to really educate themselves about what is really going on in your communities and your schools. Like, there's a reason why Black and brown people and kids who are disabled and in low income areas are having tougher times in schools. It's not just because they were born a certain color and they're predisposed by their race to act that way. Or to, is not gonna, that doesn't determine their success, it's their circumstances. So look deeper, educate yourself about what's really going on in the communities, talk to people, listen to their stories, and that's important.
And I would add that we talk a lot about training of law enforcement officers, but what I have come to realize is that the training matters very little if the politics are wrong, right? So the training matters very little if we are sending officers and we're telling them that you are at war, right. With this community. We're telling them you've got to control these kids, right? I've had a client who was maybe 19 show me a tape of a police officer calling him a savage, right? And this is a black officer. And so it is the mentality that says this population of children must be contained and controlled.
They're a threat.
Right. And there's very little other than selecting people who are not predisposed to abusing folks, and that's really hard if you have a system that teaches them that the way to get control is to abuse folks. So people just really need to think about whether police should be in school at all.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you so much. So folks, you've been listening to Tiffany Roberts, who, again, where's your form? Here it is. So she's with an organization called Lawyers United for a New Atlanta. She's also with Black Lives Matter, ATL, and I assume everybody has a website or a Facebook page if they want more information.
Yes, and you can text Black Lives Matter ATL to 23359 to be added to our mailing list, and it's lawyersforanewatlanta.org.
Thanks
Awesome.
so much.
Thank
Thanks
you
so
so
much,
much for
Annette,
having
for taking the initiative to bring Tiffany here. We'll be back again next Monday. Thank you all for listening to WFG. Stay tuned for Democracy Now! Coming up next.
Peace.
Thank you.